we're lucky to have brother Andrew Booso come from Bradford today. Originally he's from London, and he's graduated from in law from the London School of Economics. He's a member of the advisory board of the Al-Salam Institute of Sheikh, Akram Nadwi. He has also copy edited for various publishers, including White Thread Press. So mashallah, we're quite lucky to have a brother such knowledgeable as that. Right, so topic today, miracle of Hadith and its preservation.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Allahumma as'aluka al-huda wa tuqa ameen rabbil alameen ameen. It's my pleasure to finally come to the Abrahamic Foundation. It's been a wonderful thing to see from afar this venture grow with people that I have such an attachment with. And so I really pray that Allah gives it tawfiq and the project continues to grow. And secondly, it's wonderful to be able to speak about a topic where with any Islamic knowledge that we have, we always have to give credit to our teachers and those who have passed on their learning to us. And so I really have to thank first and foremost Sheikh Akram Nadwi in respect to his hadith teaching over the years, and many of our other teachers such as pioneers like Sheikh Mustafa Azmi, Dr. Jonathan Brown in the States, and also Dr. Mansour Ali, who's actually from Birmingham, but now based at Cardiff University. So, to start off with, just give a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. So there are a few preliminaries.
Should I prefer to like that?
Sorry? I prefer that.
Oh,
that's okay. So there are a few preliminaries that we'll deal with. Then introduction to hadith, authority of hadith, preservation of hadith, gradings of hadith, and responding to modern doubts about hadith. So there are two aspects really of this title which are merged into one. So the preservation of hadith is the miracle itself. Okay, so that's what's miraculous, is that the Muslim ummah has been able to create a system whereby the prophetic legacy, the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ have been retained to an incredibly high degree, and there are various degrees in that. And so when we use the word miracle here, we're talking about something which is an exceptional achievement, as opposed to say the miracle of the Quran, okay, the Mu'ajiza of the Quran, which is Allah's test to mankind that if they don't believe in this revelation, to bring forth something like it. The hadith isn't miraculous in that sense, so there isn't a test to mankind that they are to bring forth prophetic narrations that have the same style and wording of the hadith. And so its miracle of the hadith is the fact that its wordings, the topics, and the method have been preserved. And so I don't think we need to discuss why it's important, because hardly a day goes by, never mind a week, where we don't have some sort of hadith controversy with different groups throwing hadith at each other, talking about what one hadith means, or is it weak, is it not, etc. So its importance is not one that I probably have to dwell on too much. And also, we do live in an age where there's a great deal of doubts that are raised about hadith. So sometimes, I remember once giving a lecture in a particular city, and a lady came up to me afterwards and she said, well, I want to just stick to the Quran because I know the Quran is sure. And there's so much doubt about the hadith that I feel like I shouldn't deal with it because I don't know what's right, what's wrong. And so we try and deal with that to show that method isn't the correct one, and that it's not necessarily true either, that not all the hadith are of a doubtful origin. And so Muslim scholars have been able to distinguish between hadith which are weak and those which aren't, and that's the miraculous nature of the method that the scholars have produced. And so the absolute clear reality that I want to emphasize is that no one has ever claimed that all hadith are genuine. And even early Muslim scholars accepted that some hadith were altered and forged, either for good reasons or just unintentionally because people weren't very good at retaining what they had learned from the earlier people, or they had evil motives, evil in the sense that they would forge hadith about their tribe, about their city, or against political opponents, or even imams. So you have fake hadith about Imam al-Shafi'i, for instance, that were created. But the Muslim achievement has been to produce a human system whereby they are able to sift out the authentic from the unauthentic hadith. And so our Sheikh Akram Nadwi mentioned that the miracle of hadith is the formal teaching and transmission of the hadith corpus, meaning all the hadith, the demand for isnads, okay, chains of transmission, and the extraordinary commitment to checking and cross-checking their reliability is one of the most impressive and original accomplishments in the history of Islamic scholarship or scholarship generally. So the achievement of hadith isn't just something which the Muslims can claim to have put forward as a great scholarly achievement, but any scholarship or any community, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, would be proud to have produced such an intricate and detailed system in preserving any sort of knowledge. So let's start with an introduction to hadith. Okay, in terms of terminology, there are certain words which are also used along with hadith, like khabar, news, or athar, which literally means a trace. And it can sometimes be distinguished from sunnah. So the idea of hadith and sunnah are not always the same thing. So sunnah is really the way of life, or a way of acting, or a mode of life. And hadith literally in this context refers to a narration. One hadith, one narration. And that's why early scholars, they would contrast and say that some people were scholars only of hadith, and other scholars were just scholars of sunnah, and some scholars were scholars of both the hadith and the sunnah. And to illustrate what we mean, there's a famous story that the historians narrate about Imam Abu Hanifa and A'mash. A'mash was a great narrator of hadith, a great hadith scholar. And so in one gathering, a person came to A'mash's gathering and asked him a question. And so A'mash turned to Abu Hanifa and said, "What's your answer?" And so Abu Hanifa gave an answer. And A'mash said to him, "Where did you get this answer?" And then Abu Hanifa continued to narrate the same hadith which A'mash had narrated to Abu Hanifa himself. And A'mash was amazed and said, "I didn't know that you people use these narrations that we used." And he said that you jurists are like doctors, and us hadith scholars are like pharmacists. Okay, so that's the distinction, is that a jurist is someone who weighs up all the hadith. They don't just take one hadith and then make a legal ruling from it, but rather they try their best to look at all the hadith and then to come out with what's the most suitable interpretation of all of them together, joining them together, sifting through them. Whereas a scholar of hadith only knows the wording of those particular narrations. So they can tell you that so-and-so said from so-and-so with this wording in this instance. But they can't tell you how to apply it. And that's why the scholars talk about how it's not practical for people, if they want to understand Islamic law, you don't go to a hadith book for Islamic law. You go to a hadith book to understand hadith, which is a separate science. If you want to learn law, you go to a book of law, which has looked at all the hadith collections. Because if you were to just pick up something like Sahih al-Bukhari, or Tirmidhi, or Abu Dawood, or any collection, and just try to learn your fiqh from there, you would have a very narrow understanding of all the hadith. The hadith corpus is much vast, is more vast than just one collection. However, sometimes sunnah and hadith are used as synonyms, as similar terms. Dealing with definition of hadith. Linguistically, in terms of the language, it means communication, story, conversation, and this can be religious or non-religious. As an adjective, as a descriptive word, it means new. But technically it refers to four things, okay, in relation to the Prophet ﷺ. His deeds, his af'al, his sayings, his aqwal, his tacit approval, things which he approved of in his presence, his taqrir, or descriptions of his physical features, his sifat. A hadith has two parts to it, okay? There's the matan, the text of the hadith, and then there's the series of narrators, okay, the isnad, which is sometimes called tariq or wajh. So an example of a hadith text is the Prophet ﷺ related from Allah that every act of the son of Adam is for him. Every good deed will receive a tenfold reward except for fasting. And that is because fasting is exclusively for me, Allah says, and I alone will reward it. And then here's an example of a chain of transmission of this hadith. So this hadith we've just quoted in part. If you look on the right hand side, can't really see it. Okay. If you look at the right hand side, the Prophet ﷺ is mentioned. And the Prophet ﷺ then narrates this hadith to Abu Huraira, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, Ibn Mas'ud, Aisha, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, etc. and Ali. And it goes along the grid through various narrators very early until it reaches all the collectors of the major narrations. So on the left-hand side, you would have seen Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Khuzaymah, and other imams. So this is just one hadith chain. Okay, so one hadith, one text, but it has these multiple chains. And so almost, although this is a more popular hadith, many hadith will have this, where you can then plot and see who was who and who narrated from who. And so just analysing this hadith, this very famous hadith, it's narrated across many of the Islamic groups. So the Sunnis have narrated it through Bukhari and Muslim, the Shia have narrated this hadith in their own collections, as have the Ibadis. And if we look at how, just with the narrations back to Abu Hurairah, 11 students narrate it from him, and then from them 23 narrators in various parts of the Muslim world, from Medina to Makkah, Basra, Kufa in Iraq, one in Khurasan. And so you see very early on that these hadith become very dispersed very early. So from Abu Hurairah already, radiallahu anhu, you have this hadith spreading out to various parts of the Islamic world very quickly. In terms of the total number of hadith, Sheikh Akram quotes Dhahabi saying that there are 10,000 in total, sound hadith. Just talking about 9,000 from the 6 books. But if we were to include, and that's talking about similarities and ignoring variations in text. But if you were to ignore every minor and major difference in wording, in narrations, they would come up to many hundreds of thousands, Dr. Iftikhar Zaman mentions. And looking at the main narrators, the main companion narrators of hadith, this is not an absolute science, but many scholars narrate this sort of grid. And so Abu Hurairah is at the top with just around 5,000, going down and down until we see number 30, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq with 142, radiallahu anhu. However, if you were to look at this, you would think that the deen of Islam is almost based solely on Abu Hurairah. Okay, because he has 5,000 compared to just 2,630 from Abdullah ibn Umar, radiallahu anhuma. However, Sheikh Akram mentions that only about 7 hadith are narrated by Abu Hurairah alone. So almost all of these hadith, and also this 5,000 number refers to chains, not statements. Okay, so as you saw with the previous slide, one hadith, one statement, branches out into many narrations, okay, many chains of narration. But in terms of text, there's only about 7 hadith which Abu Hurairah narrated alone, which no other companion narrated. So it's not a case of the Islamic law is based on Abu Hurairah almost exclusively, okay, because most of the time you'll find a hadith that he narrates, another companion also narrates, it'll go through a different chain. And so with the Ummah, although the Ummah from the earliest times understood that Allah had sent His last and final revelation to mankind and that He would preserve it, you would see that the Ummah acted as though the responsibility for preserving it was on their shoulders. But really what they wanted to do was to be a means through which Allah worked and preserved the Quran and the Hadith. So you see with the Quran, this meticulous system, straight from Abu Bakr onwards until the codified version with Uthman, you see the meticulousness with which each generation or each group involved in the codification worked to ensure that the text was preserved. Same with Hadith, is that the Ummah worked very diligently despite knowing that Allah would preserve it. And so you see that we're not just an Ummah who leave God to take care of miracles, etc., but rather we work with full effort. And so what there isn't is a case of the Muslim there isn't a case of Hadith being caught between Muslim conviction and Western criticism. So it's not a case that Muslims for Hadith, if you just take them however they've been handed down, but for the West, when they read Hadith, they're critical and rational. There isn't this dichotomy. And so Sheikh Akram has mentioned how Hadith are divine in themselves, but the way of establishing whether Hadith is authentic or not is a human method. And that method is always open to interpretation. So Sheikh Akram would mention that if a scholar was to come about now with a method of authenticating Hadith, which is better than previous ways, we would accept it. Because the method isn't divine, but the Hadith themselves are divine. The authority, and let's move on to the authority of Hadith now. And as always, as Imam Suyuti says, that the Quran is the wellspring and the source, the manba of all knowledge. So whenever we want to understand, well, what's the authority of hadith or anything, we first return to the Quran. And so Allah talks about how the book is a guidance for people of taqwa, and that the Prophet ﷺ is to tell all of mankind that he is a messenger to them all, jami'an. And then Allah talks about how there are 4 responsibilities of the Prophet ﷺ in one ayah, where he says that it is he who is sent among the unlettered, a messenger from amongst themselves, reciting to them his verses, his ayat, and purifying them, yuzakihim, and teaching them al-kitab, the book, and al-hikmah, the wisdom. So we see these 4 tasks of the Prophet ﷺ in this verse. Is 1, teaching how to merely recite the Quran. That's one task. So if you pick up a mushaf, you see how the Prophet ﷺ taught people how to read the revelation. 2, he teaches also the meanings of the book. 3, he teaches something called the wisdom. And Sheikh Sibai quotes from a Shafi'i saying that al-hikmah here means the sunnah, the prophetic teaching. And then 4th, he makes the people purified. So you see with 2 and 3, there's something additional to the Quran that the Prophet ﷺ is teaching people. So therefore, someone who wants to say, I only want to base my religious faith on the Quran itself is telling them that they're to base their Islamic existence on things other than just the book itself. And so therefore, it's pointing to the Sunnah and these additional teachings. And then by acting upon these teachings, both the Quran and the Sunnah, one will be spiritually purified, and that's how you will attain spiritual purification. Now, classification of prophetic acts. Sheikh Sulaiman Nadwi mentions that in law there's a distinction between things which are religious acts of the Prophet ﷺ and things which he did as purely personal habits. Okay, there's a distinction. And so from those things which he did as religious acts for the ummah to follow and copy and to be rewarded by God for, they are mu'akkada and they're also mustahab. Okay, so they're things which he would do regularly and things which he wouldn't do regularly. So you know that would say the sunnahs of prayer. So you see that there are established sunnah mu'akkada prayers and there are also nawafil prayers. So this is a distinction from the prophetic actions. But likewise, he would do certain things purely out of personal habit. And those were not done with the intention of the ummah following him in those actions necessarily. However, Sheikh Akram Nadwi says, if someone follows those actions out of love, they'll be rewarded for their love, not necessarily the action. So if someone wants to eat what the Prophet ﷺ ate, or wear what he wore, simply out of their love, their love for him, they'll be rewarded for their love in why they followed the action. But nevertheless, all acts are called a sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ did it, then it's a sunnah action, but maybe not legally a sunnah. And Sheikh Sibai mentions various ways the companions would follow the actions of the Prophet ﷺ. And they would follow him almost across the board except in about 5 instances, 5 cases he mentions. So it may be something like a worldly matter. So you see in the Battle of Badr, when the Prophet ﷺ, the seerah works mention, decided on a particular location before the battle. One of the companions asked him, O Messenger of Allah, is that instructions to you from God? Or is that just a strategy of war? The Prophet ﷺ said it's a strategy of war. So the companion said, if that's the case, then I suggest that we go nearer to the water. So this companion in this instance was able to distinguish and ask the Prophet ﷺ, is this an order from God or is this just a means of war? And he was confident enough to put it forward. Secondly, Sheikh Sibai mentions if he expressed a religious opinion before there was a divine order. So again, you see at the Battle of Badr, when the prisoners were taken in, and the Prophet ﷺ made an ijtihad about what to do with the prisoners, and Umar actually had a different ijtihad, but the Prophet ﷺ went with the ijtihad of Abu Bakr. They were willing to put forward, like Umar did in this situation, radiallahu anhu, a position that was not the one suggested by the Prophet ﷺ. Thirdly, when they wanted to inquire about the reason behind the ruling. Fourthly, when they believed an action was specific to him. So if they knew that an action was specific to him, like having more wives than they were allowed to have, etc., then they understood that these were particular rulings that were specific to him. And then, Also, when he told them something, but they understood from what he was saying to them that it wasn't a command from God, but it was his personal recommendation. So you have one famous instance where a woman was previously a slave, she became free. So she now had the choice about whether she was to remain married to her husband or not. And the man was crying and wanting her to remain with him, but she wanted to divorce him. So the Prophet ﷺ recommended to her that she stay with the man. And she asked the Prophet ﷺ, are you recommending me, or is this essentially a divine order for me to do it? He said, it's just a mere recommendation. So she said, then I don't want to stay with him. So you see with the companions, they had a very clear understanding of how to interact with the Prophet ﷺ, despite knowing that whenever a commandment of his was religious, they would follow it without hesitation. Now someone might ask, oh, well, if the Quran is the Quran sufficient? And there's a clear understanding of how there's no need to explain the meanings of the Quran. For instance, if you look at, say, an order like Salah, like the prayer, Allah orders this about 73 times in the Quran. The major parts of the prayer, like the ruku', the sujood, the qiyam, okay, so the bowing, the prostrating, the standing, are mentioned. But the complete method is not explained, nor the times of the prayer, and nor can you establish that the obligatory prayers are 5, nor the number of rakats just from the Quran. So if you were to try and establish a Quranic prayer, you wouldn't have half the details that we have. Likewise with zakat, although it's ordered in more than 30 places, it doesn't mention who is liable to pay, what's the rate, and what assets are to be charged upon or not, okay, or exempted. And the same is the case with fasting. And so Dr. Yasir Qadhi once mentioned in a lecture how one of the early scholars said that what Islam would you be left with if you didn't have the Sunnah? So if someone was to just disregard without any sort of idea of sifting, and they were to disregard the whole of the Sunnah, they'd be left with a very impoverished type of Islam. And so Allah in the Quran talks about how it is we who have sent down the dhikr. And the Mufassirin, the commentators of the Quran, talk about how this refers to the Quran. The dhikr in this instance is the Quran. And indeed we will be its guardian. Okay, we will make hifz of it. We will preserve it. And Sheikh Sibari, not in tafsir of this verse, mentions how in other instances dhikr means the whole of the Sharia. And so therefore Allah will preserve all of it, Sheikh Sibari mentions. And it means everything that was revealed in the opinion of Ibn Hazm. And the evidence they use for that is in the Quran where it says, ask the people of dhikr, ahl al-dhikr, the people of dhikr if you do not know. So when you don't, and the scholars talk about how in explanation of this verse, if you don't know something in the religion, you go to those who understand the dhikr. But the dhikr is not just they understand the Quran, no, but they understand the whole of the Sharia. Hadith preservation. Sheikh Mustafa Azmi, in his book on the history of the Quranic text, mentions how from the very earliest time, the Prophet ﷺ initiated a very comprehensive Muslim educational methodology. Education was important from day one with the Ummah. And so there was this tradition of safeguarding and memorizing knowledge and also then transmitting it. And just take one, again, going back to a seerah example. And you can see it in many sources, although I referenced this to Mubarak Puri's seerah. At the Battle of Badr again, many of the people who were taken as prisoners from the non-Muslims were given a chance to ransom themselves. The Muslims gave them a chance to ransom themselves. So those who could afford to pay the ransom would pay the ransom. But some of those who couldn't pay a ransom were allowed to teach 10 Muslim children how to read or write, and that was the way that they would earn their freedom. So you see how important it was that you've got people who were trying to murder Muslims, but they could earn their freedom by teaching Muslim children how to read and write. And then you see how the companions had this system of an isnad system where they would sit and learn together. So like Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu mentions how there was a companion in Medina that he had a shift thing going on with. So when Umar was working, the other companion would be in the company of the Prophet ﷺ learning with him. And then when it was time for them to meet, they'd swap what they'd learnt, and then the person who was working would go and sit with the Prophet ﷺ, and then the other person would go and work, and then they'd swap like that. So that's just one instance of how companions would compare and contrast and learn. Now the maturity of this isnad system doesn't really happen until the 4th decade of the Muslims. So Ibn Sirin, one of the great Tabi'in scholars, says that scholars before wouldn't inquire and ask about your chain of transmission, i.e. who did you hear from, who told you, until the fitna he mentions. And the Muslim scholars agree this as being the 4th decade when Uthman was martyred. And then Ibn Sirin said, then when that happened, people would say, name your men. And those who were from Ahl Sunnah would be accepted, and those who were considered innovators, their hadith would be cast aside. And so you see by the close of the 1st century, the hadith science reaches full maturity. And the other aspect that this had was the idea of rihla, of travelling. So very early on, Muslims were spreading out, because you see with the companions, after the time of Umar, they would disperse through the Muslim lands to Iraq and Egypt and Sham and other places. And so they would naturally have students, their companions. And so they would narrate their teachings from the Prophet ﷺ. And so therefore, by the maturity of the isnad system, end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd Islamic century, Ibn Ma'in mentions how you would have to travel in order to become a mature scholar. Because if you just remained in Medina, or you just remained in Makkah, or you just remained in Iraq, you wouldn't have the most comprehensive understanding of the hadith teachings. You'd only have your rather localized teaching. And so therefore, that was one of the requirements for becoming a full scholar, was for you to travel. Now the origins of the isnad system, it's fair to say the isnad system doesn't begin with the Muslims, Sheikh Azmi points out in his work. So there were some rather vague and casual uses of it in pre-Islamic times. So some poems, some literature, but it wasn't given much importance, but it did exist in a rather haphazard way. Likewise, Zubair Siddiqui mentions that there are some Buddhist and Hindu precedents, but again, nothing as comprehensive or as rigorous as the Muslim system. And also, Siddiqui quotes Ibn Hazm saying that only the Muslims really have a completely rigorous system where they know exactly who narrates from who in every generation. Whereas with the Christians and the Jews, they have some idea of transmission, but it's nothing near as rigorous in terms of being so scientific and precise. Now, how would the Prophet ﷺ teach hadith? He'd verbally teach. So if you go to Sahih Bukhari, you'll see that there are times where he would narrate something 3 times so people understood. And then he would sometimes listen to what they heard to ensure that they had learnt correctly. And likewise, when deputations from outside of Medina would visit Medina, he would check their understanding of the religion. So you see, right from the early times, the Prophet ﷺ was checking to see whether people were understanding his teachings. Secondly, the written medium. Sheikh Azmi's research shows that there were literally hundreds of letters written to kings, rulers, chieftains, governors, and they included things of faith, how to pay zakat, how to pray. And there's also one copy of a sermon that the Prophet ﷺ gave that was sent to Yemen. And then thirdly, there was the practical demonstration of his teachings. In terms of writing down hadith, there's only one narration from the Prophet ﷺ that's authentic that prohibits writing down hadith, and it's narrated in Sahih Muslim from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radhiyallahu anhu. And this is where the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, "Do not write from me anything except the Quran, and whoever has written anything from me other than the Quran should erase it." However, and this gives us an idea of how complex hadith is, this wasn't accepted by Imam Bukhari. Imam Muslim accepts this as a Sahih hadith, going back person by person authentically to the Prophet ﷺ. But Imam Bukhari didn't feel that this went back to the Prophet ﷺ. He felt that this was actually just a statement of Abu Sa'id that had been raised up into a hadith. And so what it meant was Abu Sa'id was saying, do not write anything on the same page as the Quran. And in terms of the reason why the Prophet ﷺ would issue such a command, if it was his statement, is Sheikh Sibari mentioned, one, maybe it was abrogated, if it's true, but maybe, so he's taking it that the Sahih Muslim one is the authentic version. So one, maybe the Prophet initially, ﷺ, prohibited writing hadith, but when there wasn't so much confusion between it and the Quran, then he came up with other hadith to say, write the hadith down. Or two, the Sheikh says, maybe it was an instruction to not confuse the Quran and Hadith. But it was permitted to people who were knowledgeable and trustworthy. So it was an order to people, because remember it's a gathering maybe that the Prophet ﷺ was addressing. So maybe the Sheikh says he was addressing people who, or even in an individual case, who perhaps weren't trustworthy in knowledge, but there was permission for people who were knowledgeable and trustworthy. And 3 is maybe it was a prohibition of an official recording, like the Quran. Okay, to say that these are my hadith in the bab of wudu, in the chapter of how to make wudu, or these are my hadith in how to pray. So rather than having that sort of systematic collection of hadith that the Prophet ﷺ was teaching, rather it was a prohibition of doing that. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ, it can't have been a general prohibition, because he was aware that the Sahaba, including Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhuma, were writing hadith down. So the Prophet ﷺ knew that they were and didn't prohibit them from doing it. So you see the companions continued this method of trying to check what they learned. So Anas radiallahu anhu, who was a servant of the Prophet ﷺ for a long time, said, we would be in the gathering with the Prophet ﷺ, we would be taught, and then when we went away, we would talk amongst ourselves and we would memorize together. So they would check the learning amongst themselves. Many of the companions had their own books. So it's narrated that many of them, including Abu Bakr and Abu Hurairah, had their own books of hadith. And then these companions would also advise their successors, the tabi'een, their students, to also memorize hadith, and there are numerous narrations of these instructions. So the question might arise, what happened to these early books? In the first instance, you're able to locate these books by going to the big encyclopedias, because these smaller books became absorbed into these larger collections. So if someone was to be meticulous and to break down all the narrations, okay, if you were to break down the narrations from Ma'mar to Abdul Razak, etc., you could then plot where maybe the Sahifa, the collection of Abu Hurairah is. You could break it down. But as the Muslim community were narrating bigger books, they were narrating those in whole. And so the smaller books are narrated within them, but you'd have to sift through to pick them out. But they are still there, and you can see them by looking at the chains of transmission. So Sheikh Akram talks about how this science of hadith, this preserving of the prophetic teaching, reached maturity round about the late 2nd, early 3rd century, and its method was i'tibar. Okay, that's it, where you compare a hadith of one informant with another, and you chase up discrepancies between 2 isnads or more for the same hadith. And Dr. Jonathan Brown mentioned a 3-tier system. It's where if someone's narrating something to you, you demand their source. You don't just accept it from them. Then you investigate that person's reliability. Are they reliable? And then you see whether anyone else has corroborated that story. So that's how the hadith method worked. And as a universal tradition, as we mentioned earlier from Ibn Abi Hatim and Ali ibn al-Madini, that regionalism, this idea that the hadith scholars were in one particular location, ceases to be the case after the 3rd and 4th generations, okay, tabaqa, that the scholars narrated, which is why journeying became so important for gathering hadith. And in terms of the scrupulousness, okay, how careful were these early great scholars in checking whether this narration was correct or not, can be seen in the narration of Hamad ibn Zayd, where one of the early scholars, Shu'bah, he would go back time and again to the same narrator to check the narration he'd be given was correct. So Shu'bah wouldn't just go to a reliable narrator, take from him once and then leave, but rather over time he would continually go back just to check, is that hadith the same? Because obviously if it wasn't the same, he'd then challenge the narrator, so he wouldn't just take it and leave it. Likewise, you would see how students weren't just passive recipients. They wouldn't just passively sit in front of a teacher and accept anything he said. And so, for instance, in the case of someone like Qatada, they mention how scholars, in particular Shu'bah, who was very specific, very cautious about this, that if Qatada was narrating, Shu'bah wouldn't take the narration from Qatada unless Qatada said Sami'tu or Haddathana. So, Sami'tu, I heard, Okay, so if Qatada said, I heard this person say this, then Shu'bah would take the narration from him. But if Qatada didn't say that, then Shu'bah wouldn't. Why? Because there's a doubt. Did Qatada actually hear this, or has he heard it from someone, and then he's narrating from that original person? So that's how careful they were. Even if they had respect and love for their teachers, they would still press and press to make sure. And you have an instance where Sufyan Thawri pressed Akram ibn Ammar to ask him, did you actually hear this narration yourself? Okay, and likewise you have Imam Malik, who was incredibly cautious when it came to narrations, and he would reject many narrations that he had because of doubt about the narration. And another case is of Yahya ibn Ma'in, that he once went to 18 students of Hamad ibn Salama to check whether a mistake in a hadith came from Hamad or from one of the students. So he wouldn't just go to say one of the students of Hamad, but he literally went to 18 of them to check one hadith or hadith in general to see which ones corroborated. So he could then check. So for instance, if you have, say, 15 of the students of Hamad which agree, okay, the likelihood is that that's something that Hamad said. So then Yahya would say that mistake in the hadith came from Hamad, not from the students. But he would also see where those other 3 students maybe who differed, that the mistake came from them, not from Hamad. And so there are 2 foundational sciences that the ulama developed in order to test hadith. One is ilm al-rijal, okay, the biographical dictionaries, where they would trace the names of people, family and tribal links, occupations, residence, study, travel, teachers and students. So they have these various dictionaries plotting all these people out. And likewise the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil, where they would discredit certain narrators, talk about certain narrators as being weak, or other narrators as being strong. And so you see as an example, Ibn Abi Hatim's Kitab al-Jarh wa Ta'dil has 18,000 entries, and this is very early. And likewise Ibn Hajar's Tahdhib al-Tahdhib has over 12,000 entries. So this is 12,000 or 18,000 entries where you'd have the name, and then the scholar would talk about their background, where they're from, maybe their family links, when they lived, when they died, where they travelled to, what they transmitted, so they could then make a comparison. So for instance, in terms of the conditions for an authentic hadith, Bukhari and Muslim have a difference as to what their criteria would be on one particular point. So Bukhari would have to establish that 2 people actually met, whereas someone like Imam Muslim would just establish that they lived in the same generation, it was possible for them to have met. So they had different criteria for accepting. So these biographical dictionaries become very important. And you had books on weak narrators, strong narrators. And also when they would give a positive ruling on someone, they would have different levels of rulings. It wasn't just simplistic, that they just say, oh, so-and-so is thiqah, okay, is reliable. So that would be an absolute endorsement. But secondly, you have a relative endorsement. So for instance, like Yahya ibn Ma'in saying that Sufyan ibn Uyayna was the most knowledgeable person in the hadith of Amr ibn Dinar, and he was more reliable than Hamad ibn Zayd in the narrations of Amr. So not just simply them saying who was reliable from a narrator, but rather also distinguishing who was the most reliable from that original source. Okay, so they were very, very critical and discerning. And then likewise, they'd also give conditional accreditation. So like they give the example of, say, Mas'udi, that he was reliable but became mixed up later in life. And they would give examples of why did someone become unreliable later in life. Maybe they became senile, had difficulty remembering things, or their written materials were destroyed, maybe in a fire or something, or they lost their eyesight. So they would narrate from memory but not from their sahifa or their collection. So there's a possibility of mistakes. So sometimes they would look at the narrator and say, well, did he narrate this hadith from that person whilst that original person had his written materials, or whilst he was sane and had good control of his faculties, or whilst he could still see? And then they would try to distinguish those sorts of instances. And so you have various methods of judging hadith. You have judging the students of a sheikh. comparing between the statements of a single scholar at different times, meaning going back every year to the same teacher, asking him, "I'll narrate your hadith from so-and-so," and then checking, has he accurately narrated them each year? Comparing between oral recitation and written documents. So, having someone narrate their hadith, but then also checking it with the oral written documentation. Also comparing between the hadith and the text of the Quran. Analysing narrators, and also using maybe factual things like history and other factors to see whether this hadith is true or not. And also, and this is a very specialised area, is looking at hidden mistakes. Okay, the mu'allam narrations, hidden mistakes. And what many people don't realise is that even in something like Sahih Muslim, Sheikh Akram teaches, sometimes he's trying to teach you a narration just to show you that there's a hidden mistake in the narration. So initially you have the asl narration, the main, highest Sahih narration. And Muslim discusses this in his Muqaddimah, but didn't get time to explain this fully. So he'd have the first narration, and that's the hadith that he's presented to you first and foremost. Then he'd bring a mutaba'ah, okay, a supporting narration for that. It's not as strong as the original one, but it's a support. Then he might bring in something which has an illah in it, a hidden mistake. But unless you're a hadith scholar, you won't understand that. You'll just think it's a sahih hadith straight off, without realizing that actually Imam Muslim is trying to teach something, a subtle point. And so the fruits of these knowledge, of these ulum, was being able to distinguish between weak narrators and narrations from strong, identifying mistakes from people, identifying when really a statement is a statement of a companion and not the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, but also identifying where a narrator has added something. So by comparing students, you can see where maybe one student has added something. Okay, and the whole issue of ziyadat al-thiqah is a complex issue. Also, which scholars would omit their sources, tadlis, and also how they would analyze names and words, etc. in chains. So gradings of hadith. Okay, there are essentially only two categories of hadith, mutawatir and ahad. Okay, so there's only those two. And the mutawatir are those narrations which are reported in every single generation by so many people that narrate to another generation of so many people, to another generation of so many people, that it would be impossible for them to have colluded to create this narration. It's so many. So it's like, for instance, the example I saw Sheikh Uthmani this morning mentioning how, say, the Second World War, as an example, is that none of us have actually seen the Second World War. But we know by tawatur, by mass transmission every generation, that the Second World War took place. And likewise the First World War. Or there's a country named Australia somewhere. Okay, it's not something you don't ask. I don't ask Sheikh or Sheikh, if he tells me there's this country called Australia, I don't say to him, well, who told you that? And he says, oh, well, Sheikh Shahru told me. And so I then have to investigate Sheikh Shakib and Sheikh Shahru, and then etc. And then Sheikh Ma'ruf, and then check, is there a place called Australia? There's no need. It's been transmitted by so many people, there'd be no need to investigate it. So in terms of hadith which are mutawatir in meaning, there are many of them, whether maybe a word changed, etc. Because the early community agreed that it was permissible to narrate hadith by meaning, by ma'na. Okay, so that was an acceptable practice in the early community. Unlike the Quran, where they would only insist that the actual wording, and whether it's a wa or a fa, is narrated as the way to recite the Quran. But with the hadith it was different initially. But now we have rules where we have to narrate it as it's come down to us. But it's very rare that a hadith is mutawatir in actual wording. Syllable for syllable, word for word. Very rare that happens. But the vast majority of narrations are ahad, okay, the khabr al-wahid. And that's the vast majority of them. And the simple definition of an ahad narration is that it's anything that's not mutawatir. Alright? And there's no specific definition of how many people make something mutawatir. The ulama have different numbers given for that. Now really, as Ibn Hajar Asqalani mentions in Nubat al-Nadr, he didn't discuss the mutawatir hadith in his book on hadith principles, Nukhbat al-Fiqh, because strictly speaking, mutawatir narrations are not part of ilm al-hadith. Because ilm al-hadith is about ilm al-isnad, about looking at narrators, authenticity and weakness. So ilm al-hadith is really only about the ahad narrations. There are 4 essential gradings, okay, sound, sahih, good, hasan, weak, da'if, and fabricated, mawdu'. Ibn al-Salah mentions in his muqaddimah about how if someone was to come across hadith in personal collections, Ijaza, that are not found in the Sahihain or the well-known books, he says they're not allowed to judge whether they're strong or not, okay? Because you don't have the original books. Now Sheikh Akram Nadwi also utilizes the saying of Ibn al-Salah as to say how now in our day and age, it's not possible for us to do tashih and tad'if, okay? Authenticating and negation of hadith. Simply because, one, we don't have the original usul books. The early ulama, okay, whether it's the earliest ulama like Ali ibn al-Madini, Bukhari, Muslim, etc., going up to later generations, they had original books that they themselves heard, person by person, back to the Prophet ﷺ. So they were able to then also discuss those with other hadith scholars. The problem we have now is that those original books no longer exist. And likewise, as Sheikh Akram mentions, many of the published books that are published have mistakes in them, where names are mistaken, or phrases, whether it's haddathana, whether he transmitted to us, etc., are correctly transmitted in those works. And recently we hosted Professor Wael Halak in London, and he mentioned how only 1% of manuscripts in the Muslim world have been published. 1%. So, and there hasn't been this huge effort to collate hadith collections, etc. either. So you have to understand that it's very difficult for us to pick up a published version, even a very good version printed in the Muslim world, and then for us to make judgments based on what that printed version says. And just to show you how difficult the science, and we talked about how the science of hadith is a human science. It's not, the science isn't divine. The hadith are divine when established, but the method isn't. And just like with fiqh, you can find hadith, scholars of hadith will differ on many things. And so earlier we mentioned the difference between whether Abu Sa'id al-Khudri himself said that you shouldn't write down anything other than the Quran, or whether that's Abu Sa'id relating from the Prophet ﷺ. Likewise, the famous hadith, which is Ana Madinatul Ilm wa Ali Babuha. Okay, I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. And you see how the scholars, the great scholars, have a whole spectrum of opinions on what this hadith's rating is. So you have someone like Tirmidhi who used the word munkar, okay, unacknowledged, uncorroborated. And the early scholars, and Dr. Jonathan Brown has a great article on this, use the word munkar in different ways. It doesn't always mean it's a bad narration with early scholars. Sometimes it means it's just uncorroborated and it doesn't have narrators who are so strong as to hold the hadith up themselves. But Tirmidhi called it munkar. Bukhari said that none of the chains are sahih. Some early scholars, like Ibn Ma'in, Abu Hatim, and the late scholars like Ibn al-Jawzi, Dhahabi, Khatib al-Baghdadi, they said it's kadhib, it's a lie. But then even later scholars like Ibn Hajar said it's hasan. So you go from people saying it's a lie, okay, to those who are saying it's a hasan, it's a good hadith. So likewise, a good lesson for all of us, especially those of us who have teachers, is to also understand that our teachers don't, no matter how great they are and how pious they are, they don't encompass the whole religion within themselves. Which is why Sheikh Akram Nadwi's advice always to us has been, don't just follow one scholar. Because if you follow just one scholar, so if your teacher is only Sheikh Akram Nadwi, or your teacher is only so-and-so, the one thing you're guaranteed is to follow that teacher's mistakes. Because every teacher will have mistakes, no matter how good they are. And so if you limit yourself to one, you're bound to at least get their mistakes, even if you don't do anything else. But if you try and study with other scholars, you can maybe try your best not to have as many mistakes. You'll probably have more. But the lesson is that if you read, for instance, as nasiha, as advice to us, when you read one scholar's opinion, don't think that that's the absolute end of the story. But maybe there's more to it. And this hadith shows that there's more to the story than just simply saying, oh, well, Bukhari said it, as though that's the end and no one else can say anything after it. And that happens in any science. Okay, responding to modern doubts, the final part. Many Orientalist scholars have said that there's doubt about the whole hadith corpus. Okay, so Goldseye, Schacht and others have spoken about how the hadith had mostly been fabricated. However, there has been Western academic support for the fact that hadith were written from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Fuat Sezgin has some research on that. Nabia Abbott, also from Paparai research, shows that there's a great correlation between the early manuscripts and the collections of hadith we have now. And so the same with Quran. So when we had the Sana'a discovery in the masjid many years ago, and people thought, oh, this could show us a new Quran, a different Quran, and they ended up researching it for a long time and finding, oh, there's hardly any disparity. And even the underlay also confirmed the modern Quran. Same with hadith, as Nabia Abbott's research has shown. And Sheikh Mustafa Azmi says that, look, there are a number of responses to this questionable authenticity. One, there's no evidence of a mass project of forging hadith from the early generation, like in the Umayyad dynasty's time. Two, these people who usually say all the hadith or most of the hadith are fabricated, they have an over-reliance on a small number of sources. And then from the small number of sources, they make broad generalizations. Three, also, when scholars were silent in some books about an isnad, it doesn't mean they didn't know the isnad. It's just like how sometimes if you narrate a legal opinion, you'll just mention the opinion, but you won't necessarily name who told you from who. You'll just relate it in shorthand. And then fourthly, we have surviving sources from the 8th and 9th centuries that hadith were written down in the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions' time. And you also have the research of, say, someone like David Powers. And this is a guy, he's just researching one hadith of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, radiallahu anhu, on giving 1/3 of your wealth away. And so his research, after just studying this one hadith, he said, it's either strange or remarkable coincidence that half a dozen successors in different cities, presumably working independently, adopted the same story of origins for this story and forged hadith isnads which converge on one and the same companion. It doesn't make much sense that they would do that. And Johann Fuchs, who's named in shorthand on this, and there's reason for that, said that, it's a German name, that's how Germans spell that name, if all isnads are spurious, if they're all fake and made up, isn't it more likely that they would have attributed these hadith to older companions rather than younger ones? So, if the Muslims are involved in this mass conspiracy, why would they put most of them on Abu Hurairah? Wouldn't you pick more and more for Umar and Uthman and the other people from his paradise, etc.? He said the fact that the latter are not means that they might well be true. And research from even non-Muslim scholars, again like Howard Motsky on the Musannaf of Abdul Razak, showing how if you actually take the Muslim method of looking and collecting all the isnads and all the matans for one hadith, and you then start to analyze on that basis, you can then start to see the great accuracy in which they were narrated. But you have to do the hard work of collecting them all, rather than just making blanket statements of them being fabricated. And then finally, you could apply the words that Motsky mentioned in relation to the Quran. Despite being a non-Muslim, but after getting into isnad and looking at the narrations, he said Muslim accounts are much earlier than meaning our traditional Orientalist Western approach conclusions. Much earlier, and thus much nearer in time to the time of the alleged events than we have until now assumed in Western scholarship. And admittedly, these accounts contain some details which seem to be implausible, or to put it more cautiously, await explanation, as in his understanding. But the Western views, which claim to replace them by more plausible and historically more reliable accounts, are obviously far from what they make themselves out to be. So you see this developing critique of even Western critiques of the Islamic understanding of sources, developing more and more, even in Western academia, which is not that our our understanding of our religion is based on that, but just understand that even in their area, they're starting to have doubts about some of their own earlier research conclusions, based on further research more along Muslim lines. So in conclusion, just to recap, we've seen this amazing intellectual achievement in its depth and its breadth of hadith by Muslim scholars. And we see that it's a refined and impartial scholarship, making full research into issues. And so when you study something like Sahih Bukhari with Sheikh Akram and other people, you see that how these scholars, they were incredible academics. They just have broad principles, but rather they look on case-by-case studies. And that's why you even have in Sahih Bukhari, the narrators who are not from Ahl Sunnah. They're from the Khawarij, another sect. Because, again, Bukhari is not making just these rules that so-and-so's innovators are not going to narrate from him. He's going to establish whether that hadith was still accurately narrated or not. And we see the depth of the study, how they're able to identify forgeries, inconsistencies between the same narrators, how even some narrators would miss out their sources, etc., tadlis, how some of them would push them back to the Prophet ﷺ, others would quote them from companions, same hadith, and they'd also engage in textual criticism. So we see that the Muslims have never been naive in terms of their ulama when taking hadith, but they've retained incredibly high critical academic standards for analysing hadith.
Is it wise for unlabeled people like us just to follow a madhab and just to stick to that one scholar and just follow him and just end it there? Because
I'm glad you raised that, because I was thinking when I said it, that I wonder if anyone's going to think that I'm not just talking about hadith, and they're going to think I'm talking about fiqh. So what I wasn't saying is that in terms of following one scholar, I wasn't opposing the idea of following one school. There's a slight difference. So what I'm talking about is that if you're going to say study, even in fiqh actually it's advantageous to have, if you're going to follow, say, the Hanafi school or the Maliki school, to know that these are schools. They're not just one opinion in every instance handed down. They're literally schools. So actually, if you were to pick, say, 3 or 4 Hanafi teachers, that would be a good idea, to study with various Hanafi teachers, and to challenge them like these Hadith teachers would. They'd ask their teachers, where did you find that? Right? So when you see your Hanafi teachers, and I know Hanafis who say different things on different issues, I know Malikis who say different things on different issues. They're still Malikis and generally working within the school, generally. But that's something that people should challenge people about. So it's not about not following a school, it's about, even if you're going to follow a school, like I do, that maybe you should even think that my one teacher isn't the sole authority on that school. That maybe there's more to the school than, say, my teacher's teaching me. And then if you study others, you'll see, oh wow, so the Hanafi school is that vast. And you'll see that the difference in the Hanafi school between, say, like Sheikh Shahra, maybe you can confirm or not, the Hanafis who are in the Middle East and Hanafis in the subcontinent. Sometimes they have a different approach and different, it doesn't mean they're like worlds apart, but you might find instances where they teach different rulings on things. Like wearing a hat or something. You'll find Arab Hanafis more laid back on that than you'll find in the subcontinent, where it's a serious thing in that. So apologies.
No, just ahead. Maybe just one last question I wanted to ask myself was that that you brought up one of the slides where the amount of hadiths are narrated by different Sahaba, and I was just curious why, like people who spent a lot of time, like Abu Bakr and Umar, who spent like so much time, who were close friends as one of the Prophets, why did they narrate very few hadiths?
That's a great question. I wanted to touch on this, but I obviously forgot during it. When we say that if you look at this list, no, there it is. Okay, so you look at the list. You can't see it too well there. So Abu Huraira again debates about how long he spent with the Prophet ﷺ, 3 years, a bit more. He has 5,000 narrations. And yet you go down to number 30, Abu Bakr only narrates 142. What the ulama accept are the marasil as-sahaba. Okay? What this means is where companions would narrate from other companions without saying they heard it from that companion. So it's acknowledged that the younger companions certainly Ibn Abbas, Abu Huraira, they would be taking from other major companions. But then they would then say, the Prophet ﷺ said, but they rarely say Sami'tu. The younger companions, like Abu Huraira and others, Sheikh, Shahrul, they never say, they rarely say, I heard, okay, or he narrated to us. They will say, Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Messenger of Allah said. So therefore we accept that this is reliable. Why? Because all the Sahaba are udul, okay, they're all people who are upright. Their accuracy, their accuracy is something that can be debated, but they're all upright. So the ulama of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah have said that as long as companions are narrating from other companions, we accept it as authentic. So that's why artificially this number looks as though Islamic law is represented through the younger companions more than the older ones, but rather the situation is a bit more complex, in that simply these younger companions spent most of their time narrating hadith, but sometimes they would be actually quoting through the older ones without saying it. And we accept that as authentic in Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah.